Hey everyone, my name is Tony Burke. I'm an AFF instructor and SNTA, as well as an FAA senior rigger. And today we're going to talk about emergency altitudes. Now, a quick little preface, this is for licensed skydivers only. If you're a student skydiver, listen to whatever your instructors say. But as a licensed skydiver, one of the things that becomes your responsibility is ensuring your own safety. And part of that is to evaluate altitudes, emergency procedures, etc. on a regular basis. It never ends. To that end, today we're going to talk about emergency altitudes. Now, when you do a skydive as a licensed jumper, there's two altitudes that you're probably familiar with. It's your break-off altitude and your deployment altitude. The break-off is when you separate from the other people in the jump, and your deployment is when you deploy your parachute. Depending on the jump and depending on your skill level and your experience level, those may differ. But emergency altitudes, you should also think about, and I think I've talked to a lot of licensed skydivers, both new skydivers and experienced skydivers, who are not aware of these emergency altitudes or even or know what they are. And if they are aware of them, they don't know what altitude that they have set. We're going to talk about 3 emergency altitudes that every skydiver should have. Number 1, that's your decision altitude. That's the altitude at which you decide whether or not you have a good canopy or not. Every time you open a canopy, you have a question. Can I land this canopy? If the answer is no, then you execute your emergency procedures immediately. If the answer is maybe, you have until your decision altitude to try to answer that question. You might have line twists, you might have closed end cells, and you just want to pump brakes and see if you can clear any of this. There's things that you can do if you have a parachute that's flying mostly fine, but you're still not sure. Every jump you do, though, you should do some sort of canopy control check. There's no skydive that you should ever do where you don't do some type of canopy control check. Now, like I said, if the answer is no, execute your emergency procedures immediately. Or if you have something where you really don't have any time to do any kind of evaluation, execute your emergency procedures immediately. Probably the most common example of this type of emergency is spinning diving line twists. Now, if you have line twists where the canopy is flying straight or mostly straight, you've got a little bit of time to try to work the problem. You have until your decision altitude. If you have diving line twists, you're going to be barreling towards the ground at a very unsafe speed, bleeding altitude very quickly. You're going to get right to your decision altitude very quickly unless you do a high pull, and you don't really have time to do any kind of kicking out or like that. Don't delay, cut away. Now, if you do have a maybe situation where something doesn't quite look right and your canopy control check or whatever hasn't panned out just yet, you have until your decision altitude to make that determination. Now, if you decide ahead of time that, you know what, I just don't like the way that this looks, I don't like the way that this feels, you can execute your emergency procedures above your decision altitude. There's no problem with that. But by the time you get to your decision altitude, you must be positive you can land that canopy. For A licensed jumpers, that decision altitude is 2,500 feet. These are set by the USPA. For B, C, and D licensed jumpers, that decision altitude is 1,800 feet. So we need to make sure that we're deploying our canopies high enough that we have some time to determine whether or not we can land this canopy. A decision altitude should be a sacred altitude. It should be something that you abide by in all cases. If you're not sure you can land that canopy by your decision altitude, it's time to execute your emergency procedures. The second altitude may be one that you're not familiar with. Some places don't teach this, or maybe they mentioned it once in AFF, and it kind of went in one door and out the other. There's a lot of information you get in AFF, so that's one of the reasons why I'm making these videos, is just to kind of reinforce some of the more important points that you may have learned, and that is your reserve-only altitude. A reserve-only altitude is the altitude by which your main parachute is no longer in play. So let's say you find yourself during a skydive, you got distracted, maybe you got hit in the head and you're kind of stunned, and you look at your altimeter, or maybe your audible screaming at you, and you realize you're below 2,000 feet. Now, in no situation should you ever find yourself below 2,000 feet and not having deployed your main canopy. But it does happen. Paradoxically, you're more likely to have it happen with more experience than without experience, but it can happen to anyone at any experience level. Whether it's your fault or not, it doesn't matter. Just have this altitude in mind and have the procedure. Below a certain altitude, for me it's 2,000 feet, and I think that's a pretty good altitude to use. You want to, below 2,000 feet, no longer is your main in play, you're going to go right to reserve. The reason for this is to prevent a two-out situation. If you deploy your main canopy below 2,000 feet, there's a chance, and the lower below 2,000 feet that you deploy, there is a chance your canopy could snivel into the firing altitude of your AED. Your AED may think you're still in free fall, even though your canopy is coming out and doing its thing, and decide to deploy your reserve, and you end up with a 2-out scenario. 2-out scenarios are very dangerous, and we want to avoid them as much as we can. 2-out scenarios are one of the 3 things in instruction that we have a really hard time giving you a good answer, because there is no single answer, there's no single thing to do that's going to get you out of any situation. If you have diving line twists, cut away. That's going to get you out of that situation. If you have a toggle lock or something else that happens, we can give you a pretty good decision tree on what to do. But for a 2-out scenario, it's really kind of, you have to evaluate every scenario on its own, and we really just want to avoid it entirely. So that's why we have this altitude, this reserve-only altitude. Some people call it a hard deck. Now, one thing that I want to make a point about the hard deck, for different people, the hard deck can mean different things. For some people, the hard deck means your decision altitudes. For some people, the hard deck means no more main parachute, just go to reserve parachute. And then some of them, sometimes people think a hard deck would mean what to do below 1,000 feet, which we'll talk about in a second. So I'm not using the term hard deck because it can mean different things for different people. So I have the decision altitude, the reserve only altitude, and then we'll talk about what happens below 1,000 feet. Like I said, it's actually paradoxical. The more experience you have, the more likely you are to have this. One of the most common cases of having 2 outs is actually AFF instructors. Maybe they're dealing with a student. Maybe I've had it where a student pitched at their appropriate altitude, or maybe they were just a little bit low, and they pitched and the bag stood up on their pack and didn't leave their pack. And so we had to deal with that quickly. It only took a few seconds, but we were bleeding altitude. And by the time it got out, the other AFF instructor and I were to track away. We didn't have a lot of time to deploy, and it's very easy in the moment to sink it down below 2,000 feet and deploy, and then end up with 2 outs. So that's something that can happen to AFF instructors. But like I said, it can happen to anyone. And if you ever find yourself below 2,000 feet, just go to reserve. The 3rd altitude is below 1,000 feet. What do you do below 1,000 feet? This is one of those cases where it's hard to give you a firm answer. There's actually 3 cases, and I'll probably make a video about this, where we really have a hard time giving someone a good answer. Number 1 is a canopy wrap. Number 2 is 2 out. And number 3 is, what do you do below 1,000 feet? If you have to do something at below 1,000 feet, the normal emergency procedures don't really come into play. You generally don't want to cut away below 1,000 feet. The adage I've heard is just add fabric. But there are some situations where cutting away could save your life. For example, if you have a 2-out scenario and they're stable, biplane or side-by-side, and all of a sudden they go into a down plane, cutting away your main parachute may be the only thing that can save you. It's really hard to say in those situations what's going to happen. But generally speaking, we want to add fabric. 1,000 feet, the rules kind of change a little bit, and I can't give you a good answer on what to do in every situation. So just to review, there are 3 emergency altitudes that every skydiver should have, every licensed skydiver should have. Number 1, their decision altitude. These are set by the USPA. You can raise them if you want, but I wouldn't go any below them. For an A licensed jumper, that's 2,500 feet. For a B, C, and D licensed jumper, that's 1,800 feet. So that's your decision altitude. Number 2 is your reserve only altitude. So below 2,000 feet, you should really only be going to your reserve. Their main is no longer in play. Now, again, you shouldn't find yourself below that altitude without having deployed your main, but shit happens. So that's what you should do, is just go to reserve. And then below 1,000 feet, the rules kind of change. Generally speaking, we want to add fabric in most situations because your reserve's not going to have enough time to deploy if you have to disconnect from your main and have your reserve deployed. May not have enough time below 1,000 feet to fully deploy. So we generally want to add fabric. But again, there's situations where maybe cutting away does save you. So below 1,000 feet, just keep in mind that changes the dynamics quite a bit. So 3 altitudes, keep them in mind. Make sure you know what yours are. Make sure you're reviewing these kind of things from time to time. And thank you for watching.